from the top bunk. I've been given information from some source that the top bunk did not look like it had been available for lying down or sitting, that it was covered with all kinds of clothing and personal effects and so on. So these are all things that have to be considered. And then you can arrive at a conclusion. So my concern, my guarded criticism is not that the final diagnosis may be incorrect as to cause and manner of death, but that I think it was premature and should have been withheld as pending until all of that information has been submitted.
Well, Dr. Wecht, why do you think it wasn't done that way? You had expressed faith in the both the integrity and the competency of the medical examiner's office. Now, it seems like there is questions in your mind about this.
Well, yes, I'm still not questioning the competency or the integrity of the office or the individuals therein. However, that doesn't mean that I can't express criticism of procedures and decisions. That's been an important part of my 55 years as a medical legal consultant. Just in less than the past year, I've testified in 3 first-degree murder cases in which the chief medical examiner of 3 separate jurisdictions, all board qualified forensic pathologists, their opinions were different from mine, and mine evidently prevailed with the juries. Remember, forensic pathology and the work of a coroner or medical examiner and the conclusions of such officials doesn't make it sacrosanct, that doesn't make it impermeable to criticism or to differences of opinion. So, yes, I'm not taking back what I said about that office, but I'm not taking back my criticism of that rush to judgment.
Dr. Wecht, Dr. Michael Baden, I guess who was the previous medical examiner in New York City, did the autopsies, now sat in on the autopsy as an outside objective observer, and you know his work well. So will the autopsy report first of all be made public, and secondly, will you be able to see it at any point?
Well, yes, Dr. Michael Baden, who is a personal friend, a highly respected professional colleague, and a very experienced forensic pathologist, was there as an official observer representing the family, I guess, via their attorneys. It will be very interesting and highly relevant to learn what Dr. Baden has to say. He has not spoken out on this publicly since that time. The autopsy report has not been released, contrary to headlines in newspapers about autopsy report release. No, the official decision by the medical examiner's office has been released, but the autopsy report has not been. That will go to the family, and it'll be up to the family, the attorneys, and so on, to determine whether the details, the actual anatomic, pathological findings, including toxicological studies, including microscopic findings of the various injuries, external and internal, are released. And I am anxiously awaiting that information. I hope that Dr. Baden will be speaking out on this when the autopsy report is submitted.
So it's up to the family then whether it is publicly released. This isn't a public document that can be accessed by the media and others?
That is correct. In most jurisdictions, almost all really, if the family does not want the actual detailed report to be released, then aside from the final conclusions as to cause and manner of death by the ME or coroner, then the detailed report is not released. And people have to understand the difference between an official ruling and the details of the report themselves. I do private autopsies all the time. I just did 4 in the last 2 weeks in which there are questions about the conclusions of the medical examiners in different jurisdictions, coroners, based upon the findings, including gunshot wound cases and so on. So we'll see if the family's attorneys do come out with something. They have expressed their strong statements. I have seen this several times now that they are not accepting the ME's report. You've seen that. So I don't know them personally, but I assume they're not imbeciles. If they have their information through their forensic pathologist observer, Dr. Baden, and they know some details that you and I don't know, and if what they know is consistent with the ME's statements, or to turn it around, that they have no basis to argue that the ME's statements are erroneous, then would they be saying this? I don't know. So this is something to think about.
Well, Dr. Wecht, when news first broke of his alleged suicide, the story we were getting, the information we were getting, official or otherwise, was that he hanged himself by leaning forward and tying I guess a bed sheet around his neck. Since then, they're claiming that he hurled himself off the top of the bed, and that was enough force to break those bones, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what do you make of that new information, and how does that correspond to how likely it was to have been an actual suicide?
If it can be shown through the actual physical investigation in detailed manner of the interior of the cell, and evidence can be shown that he was on that top bunk and so on, correlated with where the bedpost tie to the bed sheet was, and what the position of the body was in when he was found, then if all of that is consistent, yes, it's possible then to get some internal neck fractures, including the hyoid bone and cartilaginous structures and so on. We don't know that, as I've already said. Number two, look at the misinformation. You just said, first they told us that he was leaning into, now they tell us that he was that he hurled himself from the top bunk. Then you know that the word had come out that there were cervical vertebrae broken. There's 7 of those vertebral bodies from the base of your skull to the bony prominence at the base of your neck. And now we're told, and it's my understanding, the cervical vertebrae were not broken, and yet they continue to talk about multiple fractures. When I say they, see, I don't even know who they is. The Washington Post and the New York Post, who are they? Where are they getting the information? We have not gotten that information from the medical examiner's office or from anybody else in an official position. So it's a confused mess. And I think that there is a moral, ethical, legal, procedural, official responsibility in a case of this nature with all of these federal and state and local investigative agencies involved to come up with definitive statements based upon actual physical evidence, and that deplorably has not been done.
Well, Doctor, with the body being moved, the crime scene, if it was a crime scene, anyway, the death scene was disturbed. The body was moved, taken to a hospital. So therefore, how do you reconstruct the position of the body, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, you reconstruct the position of the body by talking with the individuals who described exactly what his position was. This is very important. If he hurled himself from the top bunk, he's not going to wind up in a symmetrically oriented, leaning over, partially bent from the waist kind of a position on both knees, or maybe both knees just a little bit off the ground. You're not going to hurl yourself off and wind up in that position. You're going to wind up in some splayed fashion on the bed. They can reconstruct and get guys with a lot of padding on themselves to do this, and they can show. Nobody's going to wind up in that kind of composed anatomic position. So, that gets back to what we've been talking about, the investigative details. What did the person or persons who found him, what was his position? What exactly was the position of the bed sheet? in relationship to his neck. How far was his body away from that bunk bed? That's how you reconstruct.
Other than relying on eyewitnesses, can it be reconstructed at least partially from the signs on the body? You know, the way it fell, if there's bruises on the knees or elsewhere, would that help in reconstructing it, regardless of what the eyewitnesses say?
Yes, I believe that the correlation, the retroactive investigation can be conducted and accomplished in part by knowing what the body was like. Remember, the top bunk is about 5.5 inches high, and then Epstein, as a 6-foot guy, you got 3 feet at least from the waist up, so his head then was that much higher, and the body coming down. There have to be some bruises, some abrasions, contusions, which are, of course, same as, black and blue marks, bruises, and so on. So you don't fall, you don't hurl yourself off and not have such injuries. And then all of those injuries would have had to have been excised, literally, by scalpel and subjected to microscopic examination to help determine age. Are they acute? Up to 24 hours or so? Are they subacute? Roughly up to about 48 hours? Are they chronic? They go back to July 23rd or sometime after that? We can't come up with a precise minute or hour, but within a range of a few hours, we can ascertain whether they represent things that are likely to have occurred in that final event, or whether they were there before. And that all gets back to the whole business of him being in the cell with a guy charged with 4 murders, a brutal guy. I know that from somebody who dealt with him there in the New York area. So, it just defies just logical. You don't have to be a forensic pathologist or a penologist, or I've had the opportunity to talk with some people who have worked in prisons, and I know a little bit about prisons. I was chairman of the prison board in Allegheny County for 4 years. So, and remember, this jail cell, you're not talking about some one little jail cell in West Podunksville, in some rural area. You're talking about a major prison that has housed John Gotti and Bernard Sadoff and recently El Chapo, and a prison which I understand has only had 1 suicide in 15 years. 1 suicide in 15 years. How did all of this happen in this case? These questions have not been answered.
Complicating the matter is the lack of videotape, surveillance tape, either in or out of the cell, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So there again, how circumstantially convenient is it that the cameras weren't working? So we have no film footage. Just put it together. You don't have to be some wild person engaged in cockeyed conjecture that has no basis. You've got the withdrawal of the suicide watch. You've got the business with the cellmate in and the cellmate being removed 1 day before. You've got the use or the presence of material on the bed that could be used in this fashion, and then you have the cameras not working. Come on, I mean, how much is one expected to believe that this major prison in the largest city in our country operated in this fashion? That's not the way they have operated. Just look at their own record. It's not a matter of me coming in and imposing in some kind of retrospective fashion new rules and guidelines for them. Just look at their own record and compare it then to what they did in this case. All of a sudden, we've got these overworked, tired, hungry guards untrained people doing this and so on. Well, where did all of this come from? How long has it been in place?
Well, Doctor, just to clarify this, the medical examiner was in charge of publicly releasing the conclusions, correct?
That's right. And she, by the way, did not perform the autopsy, and it is my understanding she was not present at the autopsy.
So
that's something else to consider, too.
So this release of the conclusion, before all the evidence comes in, or maybe they're claiming all the evidence is in, but you're saying that much more should have been examined before it was released. Therefore, the medical examiner was not following recommended or required protocol.
Well, I can't say it's not required. There are no fixed rules. Everybody operates in their own fashion for whatever reason, and I don't know. I'm not going to engage in conjecture, but the chief medical examiner decided to come up with this conclusion, and it's my understanding that she arrived at that conclusion days before it was officially released. Something was officially released in the late afternoon of last Friday, the 16th. In my understanding, that she had arrived at that conclusion days before, earlier in the week, despite not having done the autopsy herself. And when she arrived at that conclusion, she obviously did not have the investigative reports. She did not have the toxicology report. She had not reviewed the microscopic slides of various injuries externally and internally on Epstein. So, facts are facts. And I don't know, she did it. She felt comfortable in believing that it was a suicide. That's what maybe she was told. Everybody, the jail authorities, we found this guy hung, he committed suicide. Prisoner deaths by suicide are not that rare. In fact, it's the leading cause of death among people who are incarcerated, who die. The leading cause of death is suicide. So, I want to make that clear. At the same time, without reiterating everything I've said, this is a quite different case. You could hate Epstein and despise him. The fact is, he was a major figure in part of investigation involving all kinds of people, possible criminal actions, certainly civil actions, and so on. All of those people had a right to have Epstein kept alive so that they could pursue their own legal objectives.
I know that you're being trying to be objective and diplomatic, but realistically, is there any way that the medical examiner could have thoroughly examined all this other information, all these other reports, in a few days' time?
If the autopsy was done, not if, inasmuch as the autopsy was done on a Sunday, and she herself did not perform the autopsy, well, then just look. She comes into the office on Monday. Sunday night, they were not doing toxicology testing. They were not looking at prepared microscopic slides. They did not have investigative reports. Whether Attorney General Barr and the officials of the FBI and the Federal Prison Board, the Metropolitan Correctional Center, and so on, their reports were not in. So the answer to your question is no. It is not procedurally, physically possible for her to have had all of that information in her presence on her desk if she arrived at that conclusion possibly as early as Monday, the 12th.
And it certainly isn't legitimate for a medical examiner to piece together her conclusions just from what the prison guards are saying. Yeah, he was suicidal. That's the way we found him. He hung himself, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that's just what they're saying. I mean, there's no way that's a responsible procedure for a medical examiner just to piece it together from what other people are concluding about it, who are not experts.
Well, what other people are saying and their opinions, who were involved and who were present, all of that would be part of the information. But to answer your question
What do you make of the what they're saying about how it was a different, just the contradictions in the story as we go along? I mean, one thing. Also, what do you make of the report, supposedly, that he was taken off suicide watch because his lawyers requested it?
Well, I don't understand that at all. First of all, the lawyers are not, if that be true, the lawyers are not psychiatrists, and if they did that, maybe because they wanted to, I don't know, have more time with him, or I don't understand that really, but it is up to the prison doctor, specifically the prison psychiatrist, the psychologist, in conjunction, of course, then with the warden, the people in charge, to make such a decision. It's not for attorneys to tell the prison guards, administrators, and prison doctors whether or not there should be a suicide watch. The lawyers, for whatever the reasons are, and I must confess I found that bizarre, and they would have to answer that. I can't answer for them. What in the world were they thinking of, and why did they do it? But they are not the ones that should have made that decision. They could have made a request, a suggestion, but that doesn't mean that it should have been followed.
Could it reasonably be argued that because Epstein said that he was attacked, allegedly, rather than suicidal, that would be enough to take him off suicide watch, since it wasn't a suicide attempt, but was an attack by another prisoner?
Well, if he said he had been attacked, how come the prisoner was left in the jail cell? And the prisoner was not Mr. 115-pound weakling. He was a guy named Tartaglia, who has been charged with 4 murders, and I'm told by Judge Shapiro in New York last weekend, who knows about his case, that there's actually maybe a 5th murder that he committed. If he had been attacked, then how come that cellmate, that prisoner, of all the prisoners there, was left in his cell?
Well, actually, he was removed, wasn't he? But not right away. He was removed.
What do you mean he was removed? He was removed the day before.
The day before. So, in other words,
the day before.
Yeah. So
the incident when Epstein came forward and had an injury on his neck was on July 23rd.
Yeah. So I'm again putting it all together. It doesn't fit together, does it? And where does it go from here?
Well, where it goes from here is the autopsy report is to be released to the family through their attorneys, and then we are to hear from them with their consultants and any other experts they may call upon, what they have to say. I want to hear from them, and they have to be definitive too. They can't just continue to say we disagree. On what basis do you disagree? The ball is in their court also, so they have to make a move of a definitive nature based upon tangible evidence and not just exclamatory statements that one expects to hear from attorneys who are obviously biased, representing a client, in this case the decedent and the decedent's brother.
If for some reason, Dr. Wecht, the autopsy report is not released, what happens then in terms of actually determining what happened?
Well, if it's not released and they don't speak out, then the only way in which it will eventually might become accessible is through litigation. When people file legal actions, certainly of a criminal nature, then the report would become accessible, and even in civil litigations, wrongful death actions, it wouldn't be wrongful death, the young ladies are alive, there would be assault cases, personal injury cases, then their attorneys would probably gain access to the autopsy report through court order based upon the need to learn this kind of information. So that may happen looking for something much sooner than that. I'm expecting something when the autopsy report is released to the family.
Dr. Wecht, thank you very much for being with us once again.